You are standing at Mather Point on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. There is a paved path under your feet. There is a visitor center 200 yards behind you with a gift shop in it selling postcards of the exact view you are looking at. There are railings along parts of the edge, interpretive signs explaining the geology, and somewhere between 200 and 400 other people standing within a short walk of you, all doing the same thing you are doing. It is the most dangerous single location in the entire national park. People die of heat on the Bright Angel Trail every summer. The river at the bottom runs cold enough to take a strong swimmer in minutes. Both of those are real, and both of them kill fewer visitors than this pavement does. In the crowd, 40 steps from a parking lot. What kills people here is ordinary behavior. They fall doing the single most common thing a person does at a scenic overlook, an action so automatic you have performed it hundreds of times without once deciding to. It takes about 2 seconds. You are going to recognize it immediately. On the 3rd of July, a 59-year-old woman from Scottsdale, Arizona, named Maria Salgado Lopez, was at this overlook with her family. She had walked out from the visitor center with her family, the way about 5 million people a year do. She was taking a photograph. Within a few minutes of that photograph, she was roughly 100 feet below the rim, in terrain that required a technical rope team to reach. That was not bad luck. Every element of it is documented, repeatable, and happening at that overlook this afternoon, to people who would describe themselves as careful. Start with the geography, because the geography is doing something to your brain before you have made a single decision. The south rim sits at about 7,000 feet. The river sits at roughly 2,400. That is close to a mile of vertical air, and your visual system has no reliable way to process it. Your depth perception works by comparison, and it runs out of comparison somewhere around the height of a tall building. Past that, it simply stops resolving distance, so the canyon flattens. It reads to your eye more like a backdrop than a hole in the ground. Photographers have complained about this since the 1890s. Put a person in the frame for scale and the canyon shrinks. Take them out and it turns into wallpaper. The reason your pictures never look like the thing you are standing in front of is the same reason the edge does not feel like an edge. Now add the second thing, which is the part almost nobody accounts for. Mather Point is engineered for comfort. That is the design brief. Paved walkways, signage, railings in the sections the Park Service assessed as highest traffic. Restrooms, shade structures, crowds of ordinary people in ordinary shoes, none of whom look like they are in danger, because none of them are, right up until one of them is. Every one of those features sends your nervous system the same message, and the message is that this environment has been made safe for you by somebody else. That feeling of safety is not protecting you from the hazard, it is the hazard, all of which would be fine if the barrier ran the whole way. Mather Point is a natural rim with railing along the busiest sections and open rock along the rest, and the transition is never announced. You walk, and at some point the barrier beside you stops existing. The pavement continues, the crowd continues, the view is the same view. Your body does not register the change because your body was never tracking the railing. It was tracking the crowd, which is still there, and the pavement, which is still there, and the general atmosphere of a managed tourist site, which is still there. The one variable that actually mattered is the one your attention was never assigned to. A railing that ends is survivable on its own. Thousands of people walk past the end of it every day and go home. It turns lethal only when it meets one specific behavior, and that behavior is where this stops, being a story about a canyon. So now put a camera in the scene, and watch how ordinary this gets. You are framing a photograph of somebody you love with the canyon behind them. They are too close, or the frame is too tight, or a stranger has wandered into the shot. And so you do what every human being does, automatically, without ever making a conscious decision about it. You take a step backward to widen the frame. While you do it, your eyes are on the screen. That is the entire mechanism. That is what kills people at the most photographed viewpoint in Arizona. A step backward, taken by someone whose eyes are on a rectangle in their hands, in a place where the ground stops without announcing it. Park officials and the Coconino County Medical Examiner have been consistent about this for years. The rim deaths at the Grand Canyon are overwhelmingly accidental. They are trips, slips, and missteps, not daredevils. The public imagines these deaths as the consequence of somebody doing something obviously stupid, and the record does not support that picture. Read that again, because the uncomfortable part is how familiar it is. How many times have you stepped backward while looking at a screen? Not at a canyon, on a sidewalk, at a wedding, on a beach, at a scenic pullout on some highway, framing a group so everybody fits. You have done it more times than you could count. And every one of those times it was completely fine, and that history is exactly what makes it dangerous in the one location where it is not. Every one of those times it worked. That is the problem. This is the thing people misunderstand about accidents in engineered environments. The behavior that kills you is almost never new behavior. It is old behavior, deeply practiced, extremely reliable, transplanted into the one setting where its assumptions no longer hold. Your body has thousands of successful repetitions telling it that a step backward is a safe move. Your body is right almost everywhere on Earth. The rim is one of the few places where the accumulated evidence of your entire life is wrong. So your own history is working against you. That would be bad enough on an empty rim. At Mather Point, you are also standing in a crowd, and the crowd is doing something to your judgment that almost nobody notices, and the crowd makes it worse, not better. When you stand in a group of 200 people at a viewpoint, your threat assessment quietly outsources itself. Everyone around you looks relaxed, because they are. Some of them are standing closer to the edge than you are. Human beings read that as safety information, because in almost every other context in our evolutionary history, it was. At Mather Point, it tells you only how many other people also believe the railing is continuous. 200 people, all quietly checking each other, none of them checking the ground. There is one more layer, and it is the one that has changed most in the last 15 years. Now put a phone in every one of those 200 hands and add an audience to every photograph. A photograph used to be an act of memory. You were storing something for yourself. Now the image has an audience attached before the shutter closes, and an image with an audience has requirements. The strangers have to be out of the shot. The angle has to prove you were there, at the edge, rather than standing back with 100 other tourists. That pressure is real, and it moves people toward the rim by inches rather than by feet. Nobody decides to stand somewhere dangerous. They decide the composition is off by about a foot. The Park Service now puts staff at high traffic overlooks in peak season for exactly this reason. The photography guidance exists because the incident reports kept describing the same 2 seconds at overlook after overlook year after year. All of that would still be recoverable if there were any time to recover in. There is not, and the arithmetic is brutal. The first 2 seconds of a fall run differently than almost everyone imagines, and that gap is where people die. A body in free fall covers about 16 feet in the first second. By the end of the second second, it has covered roughly 64 feet because the distance grows with the square of the time rather than in a straight line. The gap between those two numbers is where people die. The first fraction of a second feels like almost nothing is happening. By the time any human being has processed that they are falling, formed an intention to do something about it, and sent a signal to a muscle, the useful part of the fall is already over. Put those two numbers against each other and the result is worse than it first sounds. Human reaction time to an unexpected event runs about 1/5 of a second at best, and that is for a trained response to an expected stimulus, like a sprinter leaving the blocks. For a genuinely unexpected event, with no rehearsed response available, it is longer. There is nothing to grab in open air, and the rim provides no reliable handhold on the way past. By the time you know you are falling, you have already fallen further than the height of the visitor center behind you. At the rim of the Grand Canyon, that geometry is fatal. The faces below the developed overlooks are steep, broken, and frequently undercut, so a falling body contacts rock rather than sliding down a slope-shedding speed. Rock at that scale simply holds. Almost everyone carries a quiet assumption that a fall gives you a chance to react. Some instinct would fire, a hand would find rock, the body would sort it out. That assumption is doing real work in the mind of everyone who shuffles 6 inches closer for a better angle, and there is nothing behind it. There is no reaction available. The decision was made when your foot left the ground, and the last moment you were genuinely in control of the outcome was the moment before you stopped looking where you were standing. So the pavement, the signs, and the railings are protecting visitors and producing the behavior that kills them at the same time. Safety engineering has a name for this: risk compensation. The answer is going to sound like an accusation against the Park Service. It is not. It is worse than that, because nobody did anything wrong and it happens anyway. Make an environment feel safer, and people spend the safety rather than bank it. Drivers with anti-lock brakes follow more closely. Skiers in helmets ski faster. Children on padded playgrounds climb higher. The protection is real every time, and every time human behavior walks forward to eat some of the margin it created. A developed viewpoint is risk compensation made physical. The pavement, the signs, the railing on the busy stretch all reduce risk, and all of it encourages visitors to relax the caution they would have brought to an unmarked cliff. On bare rock, people stay back and watch their feet. Give them a paved path and they will walk it looking at a phone. Tearing out the pavement would be worse, but it means the developed rim quietly hands you a job the wild rim never had to. You are now the one supplying the caution at the exact spot where everything around you is telling you that somebody else already did. Almost nobody knows they have been handed that job. So the railing that ends without warning is also the railing that convinced you there was a railing. The pavement that makes the walk easy is the pavement that makes you comfortable enough to look down at a screen while you take it. Every protective feature at that overlook is doing two things at once, and only one of them is on the sign. And this is not a rare interaction between an unlucky person and an unlucky spot. The park has arranged, without meaning to, for it to be as common as possible. Ask a visitor where people die in this park, and you will hear the trails, the heat, the river. The falls are the part that surprises them, because a substantial share happen at or near the developed rim, within walking distance of a parking area, to people who never intended to do anything strenuous. That distribution makes sense the moment you notice what the developed rim actually is. The backcountry filters people. To get deep into the canyon, you need water, time, fitness, and usually a permit. Every one of those requirements functions as a screening mechanism, quietly removing the least prepared visitors before they ever reach the dangerous part. Nobody accidentally ends up 8 miles down the North Kaibab. The rim filters nobody. It is open to everyone all year at no cost, with no preparation whatsoever, and it receives the overwhelming majority of the park's roughly 5 million annual visitors. Small children are there. People in their 80s are there. People who arrived 40 minutes ago and are leaving in another 20 are there. And a mile of vertical air is there on the other side of a boundary that is only sometimes marked. You have taken the least prepared population in the park and stood them next to the most unforgiving single feature in it. Every day, all year, about 5 million times. The only reason the numbers are not far worse is that the vast majority of those people never take the one step that matters. And the park is good at saving people. That is the part that makes the next fact land, because at the rim, being good at it stops mattering. If a hiker gets into trouble in the inner canyon, there is usually a window. Heat illness develops over hours. Dehydration announces itself. A twisted ankle strands somebody who is still fully alive and can be reached, treated, and carried out. The overwhelming majority of the park's several hundred annual search and rescue operations end with a living person walking or riding out, and that is the normal outcome, not the exception. A fall at the rim has no window at all. There is a person standing on rock, and then the rock is empty. The whole event completes itself before anybody watching has finished forming a sentence, which means the entire safety margin at a viewpoint lives in the placement of your feet and nowhere else. Because the railings are not continuous, and that is the detail that turns a comfortable overlook into a fatal one. At which point most people assume the rescue system absorbs the risk. At the rim, it does not, and the reason is geometry rather than effort. What happens after a rim fall is the part visitors never picture. 100 feet below the rim is not a ledge you climb down to. The rim of the Grand Canyon is a broken vertical stack of sandstone and limestone benches, loose talus, and undercut faces. There is frequently no walkable route from the top to a person 100 feet down. Reaching them is a technical rope operation run by trained personnel who have to be assembled, briefed, and lowered. That takes time, because a rescue done carelessly produces 2 casualties instead of 1. Park Service personnel responded to Mather Point in the early afternoon of July 3rd. They located her roughly 100 feet below the rim in terrain that required a technical recovery. She did not survive the fall, which is not a failure of the people who respond, it is the opposite. The Grand Canyon runs close to 300 search and rescue operations in a busy year, among the highest of any park in the country, and those crews are extraordinary. On a rim recovery, they are working against the same geology that caused the accident. So every protective system in the park, the rangers, the helicopters, the rope teams, the preventive program, all of it operates on the wrong side of an event that finishes in under 2 seconds. At the rim, rescue becomes a recovery service. The only margin protecting you is the one that exists before you step, and there is nothing behind it. That is the machinery. This is what it did on the 3rd of July. Maria Salgado Lopez was photographing, or had just finished photographing, alongside her family. She was off the paved trail. She stepped off the edge, apparently without intending to, in front of the people who had come there with her. The rest of that afternoon is where most accounts start inventing. The public record does not preserve the interior of that moment. What she was framing, which way she moved, what anybody said in the seconds before, all of that stayed with the people who were there. The documented facts are the location, the date, the fall, the recovery operation, and the pattern this death sits inside. That is the whole record. The pattern is the point, because the pattern is the thing that can still be acted on. And there is one more thing about that afternoon that almost never appears in coverage of these deaths. She was with her family. That is in the record, and it changes what this event was, which changes what you have been picturing for the last 15 minutes. A rim fall at a developed overlook is witnessed. People are standing there because it is a place worth looking at in company, with somebody holding a camera. Whatever happened at Mather Point on the 3rd of July happened in front of people who loved her, in bright daylight, on a paved walkway, surrounded by strangers on holiday. And then those people had to stand at the rim and wait, because there was nothing any of them could do. There is no version of that afternoon in which a family member climbs down. The same geology that makes the fall unsurvivable makes the rescue technical. They waited on the pavement, at a scenic viewpoint, with the gift shop 200 yards behind them, while a rope team was assembled. The rangers who handle these calls do it several times a season, at the same handful of overlooks. Ask them what they remember, and it is rarely the recovery. It is the people at the top being asked to step back from the edge. That is the actual cost of the 2 seconds, and it is not paid by the person who takes the step. At this point, the instinct is to start sorting, to find the thing she did that you would not have done and file her somewhere that does not include you. That instinct is the last thing standing between you and the same afternoon, so it is worth taking apart. The victims of rim falls are not a type. Park officials have said plainly and repeatedly that these deaths are accidental. The people it happens to are middle-aged, sober, and paying attention to a camera. The people this happens to are middle-aged. They are careful in the rest of their lives. They are often parents and grandparents, and they are standing at a viewpoint doing exactly what the viewpoint is for. There is no behavior to point at afterward that separates them from everybody else who was standing there that day and went home. That is precisely why it keeps happening, and it is why the specific 2 seconds matter more than the headline does. You cannot protect yourself from a category you have excluded yourself from, which leaves one question actually worth asking, and the Park Service has already answered it. The Park Service could tell visitors to stay behind the railings. That would be dishonest, because the railings run out. They could tell them to avoid the edge, which would be absurd, because the edge is the product and 5 million people a year come specifically to stand near it. So the guidance they actually publish is 1 sentence long, and it is aimed at your feet rather than your judgment. Stop walking before you raise the camera. That is the whole instruction. Plant your feet, then look at the screen. They wrote it that narrow because they know which 2 seconds do the killing, and because being careful, being aware, and judging the situation correctly have all already failed by the time you are standing on unfenced rock, feeling comfortable. The instruction skips your judgment entirely and installs a habit that runs while your judgment is wrong. Good safety instructions almost always look like that. They assume you will be distracted at the exact moment it counts, because that is the moment the distraction arrives. So if you keep one thing from this, keep the ranger's sentence and keep it as a physical habit rather than an intention. Feet stop, then camera up. If the frame is wrong, camera down, eyes on the ground, move, then camera up again. 3 seconds. Assume a railing will end somewhere behind you without announcing itself, because it will. Treat the crowd as scenery rather than evidence, because every one of them is reading you the same way and none of you have checked the ground. And treat any unfenced rim as though it ends 1 step sooner than it looks, because at that scale your depth perception has already given up. And understand what the canyon is underneath the postcards. It is a mile of open air that has been widening for 6 million years, indifferent to whether you are being careful, whether you drove 11 hours to get there, or whether the picture came out. Maria Salgado Lopez did nothing that most visitors to that overlook have not done. That sentence is not supposed to be comfortable. She was not careless in any way the record supports. She was doing the ordinary thing, at the ordinary place, on an ordinary summer afternoon with her family beside her. The difference between her afternoon and yours comes down to where the ground happened to stop. That is why the 2 seconds are worth the 3 seconds. If you made it this far, you now know something the 200 people standing at that overlook this afternoon do not, which is that the safest feeling place in the park is the one that kills the most visitors, and that the thing which does it is a habit you already have. Subscribe, and the next one of these will reach you before you need it. It might be the cheapest piece of survival gear you ever pick up,